Whether it's to improve your assessment of a wine's quality, impress your friends at parties, or master that elusive skill of blind tasting, learning how to deductively taste wine, and more importantly, how to interpret what you taste, is absolutely quintessential to honing the skill. In this series, I'm going to show you how to taste wine like a pro. So today we're going to learn to taste white wine deductively. And hey, let me know in the comments what white wines are you guys drinking right now. So when we think about tasting deductively, really we're thinking about four things. We're thinking about sight, we're thinking about smell, taste and thought. i.e., we are going to look at the wine, we're going to smell the wine, we're going to taste the wine, and then we're going to reflect and think about the attributes we picked up along the way and see what they can tell us about the wine. So first, sight. What you want here is a little trusty white background if you can. A napkin works fine, or a little piece of paper. And we're going to look first at the clarity of the wine. So essentially what this is just going to tell us if there's any haziness to the wine, if there's any little bits floating around in it, be it cork or sediment, anything at all that might lead us to believe that the wine is anything less than perfect. Now, in the past, this would be very easy to kind of examine, but these days, things like organic and non-filtered, non-fined wines are very popular. So sometimes you can get a little bit of haziness or cloudiness in the wine, and it's not actually a fault in the wine. So context is important. But if we're looking at this wine, we can see that it's absolutely crystal clear, star bright, the whole thing. And then we want to look at the color. So the color of this wine, you can use your own nomenclature if you like, but essentially I'm going to say that this is kind of pale to maybe a light kind of lemony color. It's not particularly watery, but it's not quite gold either. So what this is telling me is that the wine is probably pretty young, and it probably hasn't seen much treatment. If the wine were to be a deeper color, say something moving toward gold, it can be indications of maybe the wine has spent a little bit of time on the skins while it was being made. It might be particularly ripe. It might have spent some time in oak, or indeed it might have spent some time aging in a wine bottle in a cellar. So there's lots of things that lead the color to be one way or another. In this case, looks like a relatively young wine. What else can we tell? We can swirl the wine, and if we wait just a moment, we can see that there's these little tears or legs on the wine. And essentially what they are, this is glycerol. So it's an indication of either sweetness or alcohol in the wine. Now, the legs on this wine really are pretty ill-defined. I would say that they're, medium at best. And I know that this is a dry wine. I'm kind of cheating, I know it already from the bottle. So that's going to lead me to think that the wine doesn't have a lot of sweetness, i.e. sugar, and also doesn't have a lot of alcohol. So the alcohol here is probably about midway, so in around 12.5%. So you can see with this deductive method that we're already being able to figure things out about the wine, but long before we've tasted or smelled it at all. So the next thing to consider when we're deductively tasting our wine is the smell. And the first thing we want to get a whiff of when we get our nose in here is the intensity of the aroma. Now, a lot of people find it difficult to kind of understand precisely what intensity defines. As I see it, it's kind of a mixture between how powerful the aroma is and also how many clear, definable characteristics you can pick up out of it. So not merely like you get a big blast of citrus fruit, but that you might be able to pick out lemons, limes, etc. Get my nose in here. I would say that this wine is about medium plus intensity. There is quite a bit of aroma coming off it. I can pick out a few things. When we think about what those aromas might be, it's useful to think of it in terms of kind of clusters. So we'll break that into three. That's going to be primary. Primary characteristics are anything that come from the grape, essentially. These can be fruit characteristics most notably, but also they might be floral, herbal, spicy, herbaceous, even earthy at times depending on the wine. Then we have secondary characteristics, and these are essentially any characteristics that have been brought about by something the winemaker did to the wine. Very commonly this is kind of, usually it's oak. Usually it's oak. There are other processes as well, like malolactic fermentation. You get it in Chardonnay quite a bit, and that gives you these kind of buttery or creamy characters. And Lee's aging as well is another popular one. That gives you a kind of a biscuity or maybe even brioche-y, bready character, particularly relevant for champagne, but we'll cover that in another video. And then there are finally tertiary characteristics. And tertiary characteristics are what happens when the winemaker has essentially given the wine to time. So the bottle has been sealed with the cork, placed in a cellar to age, and any characters that evolve or even, arise out of this process, they're deemed tertiary characters. Very typically they can be a morphing of fresh fruit into things like masticated and dried fruits. You can get vegetal or even herbal characters become very earthy, maybe nutty, maybe caramel. There's absolute plethora of things that can arise, but this tertiary element is something that arises primarily from age. So that's not going to be on the cards today. What is on the cards is a lot of fruit. So I would say straight off the bat, it's very citrus driven. So certainly lemon character, maybe a touch of lime in there also. Orchard fruits are coming through as well. I would say apples, probably in that kind of mid-spectrum between a green and a yellow apple, maybe a little bit of both. Not particularly fresh. I would say that there's a little touch of ripeness to the fruit, and the nature of the fruit is an important thing to take note of as well, because that can give us an indication of the type of climate that the wine comes from. If the fruits are particularly fresh and vibrant and maybe even acidic or tart, it tends to come from a very cool climate. If the fruits operate in a more sort of let's say tropical spectrum, or they have a particular ripeness to them, that can be an indication of wines coming from a more kind of warm or even hot climate. Certainly apples coming out here, pears as well. Maybe something a little more, maybe something a touch herbaceous, maybe a touch of kind of almost like a grassy character, which again, we're going to take note of these characters as we go along, and we're going to put them together at the end. That grassy character is important. It's quite subtle in this wine, but I think it is going to be an important characteristic at the end. Now, onto the palate. So when we taste wine, we can do it in two ways essentially. If we're being particularly responsible, we're going to spit it out. And what we're going to do here is take a little bit into the mouth. We're going to swish a little bit around and then draw oxygen over the top of it before we actually spit the wine out. That's going to just extradite that whole process of releasing the aromatic compounds. And then we're going to spit it out, give it just a moment and let those flavors evolve on the palate. Really after just about 2, maybe 3 seconds, those flavors that we spoke about on the nose, they're starting to come through again here. Definitely citrus fruits, a little bit of orchard fruit, and again that herbaceous quality is a little bit more pronounced here on the palate. There's another way of tasting, of course, and that's to swallow the wine. But if you're going to do that, you might as well make use of a useful little tool called retrograde olfaction. And essentially what this is going to be getting your nose involved in the tasting process. So what you do is take a little bit into your mouth, swallow it, take a breath in through your mouth, and then breathe out through your nose. That's going to bring a lot of these aroma compounds that are now sitting at the back of your throat up through your nose and getting that olfaction, i.e. your smell receptors working again, and that's going to work in tandem with your taste buds to give you an idea of the flavors of this wine. It can just make it a little bit more intense, a little bit more visceral for some people. And again, you can feel it almost like at the roof of your mouth, these flavors really starting to evolve. And again, very much what we were saying, citrus and orchard fruit driven in the sort of fresh moving to ripe spectrum with a little bit of a herbaceous quality as well. Now flavors are one thing, but flavors are really just a direct kind of follow on from aromas. And anyone who knows anything about tasting will tell you that 80, 70, 90, whatever the number is in the nose, right? It's huge. If you're going to get your aromas, your flavors, most of that is coming from the nose of the wine. What's particularly useful about tasting the wine on the palate is not so much the flavors, but the taste components. And tastes differ from flavor because we can feel them. So tastes are things like sweetness, maybe you come across umami flavors of savoriness, sour, that kind of acidic tartness we get, spiciness, alcohol heat. These are things that we can physically and viscerally feel on the palate. So they're not as subjective as flavors. These things are quite objective. And they will tell us a story about the wine. So if I take a little sip here. So first of all, I'm thinking about intensity once again, like we did on the nose. The intensity here, very similar. It's kind of in that medium spectrum. There is a little bit of fruit, a little bit of herbaceous quality, but we're kind of there. So we're in that kind of mid-range. Then we think about dryness, and dryness is actually sweetness, often mistaken for the tannin component of red wines, and we'll cover that again. The dryness in this wine, this is a dry wine. It has no sweetness to it, very small amount of residual sugar on the palate, so we would say it's a dry wine. The acidity is a little bit elevated. It's definitely, and when we talk about acidity, we feel that kind of tingling on the side of the tongue, a little bit of salivation, you know, when your mouth starts to water. So this is definitely on the higher spectrum there, kind of in this medium plus, maybe to high side. Then we think about alcohol, and coming back to what we said at the very beginning with the site, the alcohol we thought at that point, given the legs on the glass, would be in around that kind of medium area. And that is very much the case. When I taste the wine, let a little bit roll back on the throat, smell it, I'm not getting a lot of that heat that we get from a very high alcohol wine. Now, when we think about body in wines, it's a very useful component to actually pin body to alcohol. So that's kind of a really nice and effective starting point. Start there and then use the other structural components to bring the body up or down appropriately. So for example, in this wine, we're saying that the alcohol is medium, so therefore the body is medium. Now we think about sweetness. Sweetness typically will enhance the perception of body in a wine. So there's no sweetness here, this is a dry wine, so it's not going to do anything to the body. Acidity, on the other hand, i.e. the freshness of the wine, tends to lessen the perception of body. So while we have medium alcohol here, we actually are verging on high acidity, certainly medium plus. So that's going to bring our perception of body down a notch. So this wine would be considered probably somewhere between low and medium body, maybe in that kind of medium minus spectrum. So then we have the length of flavor. So this is basically how long you can taste the wine after you've either swallowed or spit it out. Typically it's associated with quality. Wines that basically are here today, gone tomorrow, you taste it and it's gone just like that, tend to be representative of a lower standard or lower quality of wine, whereas something that the flavor persists long after it's left your mouth tends to be associated with a higher quality. So with this wine, I would say that the length of flavor is very much in that kind of medium spectrum. So finally, we're going to think about the wine, and thinking about the wine is really dependent, how we think about it is dependent on what our objectives are. In certain cases, we'll be blind tasting, we won't know what the grape is or anything like that. In some cases we will. In this case we have a Bordeaux, we know the vintage, we know the wine. So maybe we're looking to assess the quality of the wine. In assessing quality, there's kind of 4 nice attributes we like to assess. That is balance, length, intensity and complexity. And if you can kind of get a hold on all of these, it can give you a nice indication as to the quality of the wine. Of course, there will be caveats to this, there will be exceptions that prove the rule, but it's a nice rule of thumb to start with. Now, balance is an interesting one because it's one of these phrases that's touted around all the place, but nobody seems to know what it means, or at least they use it erroneously. So when we talk about balance, we need to talk about something being in balance with something else, obviously. The most common components that we would kind of compare in terms of balance would be things like the flavor intensity, so the concentration of the wine, you might say, versus something like the structural components. So for example, if it's a wine like Chablis, for example, we know it's a nice fresh high acid wine, but if the flavor intensity is not kind of on par with the acidity, then we would say that the wine is slightly out of balance. It's too acidic, it's too fresh with not enough fruit to back that up or to balance it out. You can also have structural components in balance with one another, and this is predominantly when something sticks out. A big culprit for this these days, especially with red wines, is alcohol. And with our old mate global warming encroaching on wine regions more and more every year, we see alcohol levels rising every year. And unfortunately, a lot of winemakers just cannot integrate this kind of newfound alcohol into their wine successfully, particularly at the lower end, and that's understandable. So you'll get wines with maybe 15% alcohol and it just sticks out like a sore thumb. It's burning on the throat, it's kind of heated on the nose as well, and it just takes away from the overall enjoyment of the wine. So we would say that those wines are out of balance because the alcohol is just too pronounced. And that works for every characteristic that you basically apply to wine. It can be too sweet, it can be too acidic, it can be too tannic. And some of these things can be changed in the winemaking process, and some of them can be changed with time in an oak barrel or a wine bottle. But when you're tasting it, this is what you got to have in mind when you're thinking about balance. Length, as we said already, is usually a good indicator of quality in a wine. Not always, but it is usually. Intensity, again, as we said before, is a measure of both the power of the aromas or flavor compounds in the wine, but also your ability to define individual ones. So it's not just a blast of red fruit, it's red currants, it's raspberries, it's cranberries, it's this, that, and the other. Your ability to actually pick out very noticeable, well-defined fruit or other characteristics is a mark of intensity for me. And the final measure is complexity. And complexity is a tricky one because, again, context is always important with these things. Complexity usually is picking up, a wine with medium level complexity will have more than 5 easily identifiable components, and usually they'll range between the primary and secondary flavor or aroma characters. So that's stuff that comes from the grape and stuff that the winemaker does to it. But not always. Some of the highest quality Rieslings in the world are very complex, and of course they never see oak. So you always have to take the context of the wine into consideration when you're thinking about complexity. Of course, the greatest and the most complex wines will have a plethora maybe of fruits all the way through the spectrum. So they'll still have a little bit of primary fruit left. Of course, they'll have those secondary characteristics, and they'll be starting to develop those wonderful tertiary characters as well. So that's something to consider. Again, when we're talking about quality, if you hit all those 4, balance, length, intensity, and complexity, and you can hit them at a high enough level, it's a good indication of a very high quality wine. Another thing to think about in terms of thinking about the wine at the end is perhaps its ability to age. And the quality of the wine is going to come into that place. The predominant things we look for in terms of aging a wine are going to be the concentration of the fruit. So does it have enough intensity of fruit character as a young wine to see it through development into an older wine? And then does it have the structural components that are going to facilitate that evolution? So things like acidity, things like tannin, things like alcohol, these act as sort of antiseptics, antioxidants, antibacterials in a way that protect the wine on its journey through this kind of tertiary character development. So it needs to have both that concentration and those structural components that will protect it through that process. So in conclusion, when you're thinking about the wine, it's very important to have your goals in the right place. You need to know what it is you're trying to find out, what it is you're trying to assess, and just bring all those characters together that you accumulated along the way and apply them as deductively and as cognitively responsibly as you can. So there you have it, a hopefully useful guide on how to deductively taste white wines. If you're interested in learning about how to taste other styles of wine, check out the rest of this series on my channel. And as always, if you do find value here, please consider subscribing, smash like, and until next time, cheers.